Watch the steam rise from a battered cast iron pot, filling the air with memories of simpler times. The clatter of wooden spoons, the scent of beans and bacon, laughter echoing around the kitchen table. These were the sights and smells of a 1970s hillbilly supper. But why did these one-pot wonders, both humble and hearty, vanish from our kitchens? What happened to those lost recipes? And could the flavors that once brought families together make a comeback today? Let's open the lid and find out. Step right into a 1970s kitchen, and you'll feel it instantly. The coziness, the little bit of chaos, and the magic humming beneath it all. There's a cast iron skillet on the stove. The click and hiss as something hearty starts cooking. A stack of flour-dusted recipe cards on the counter, and the gentle hum of conversation floating through the air. This was a place built for comfort, for big flavors cooked slow, for family dinners stretched over stories and second helpings. It all started with the pantry. Back then, there weren't 50 types of pasta, fancy sauces, or shelves full of pre-made meals. Just simple staples, stuff you could find at every general store, and things every family relied on. There were cans of tomatoes stacked next to dried navy beans and pinto beans, sacks of rice and flour, and jars of pickled okra or green beans left over from canning season. Even if money was tight, pantries felt full, and clever cooks learned how to stretch every last scrap into a meal you could smell from the porch. One night might be all about a pot of beans, simmered with a slab of pork fat back, an onion tossed in, and maybe, with good luck, a bay leaf if someone had one hidden away. Another time, leftover potatoes would get dressed up as a skillet supper, cubed, then fried with peppers and onions, and maybe a few slivers of smoked sausage. The whole thing coming together in just one cast iron skillet that seemed to last forever. That cast iron skillet, there was always one on hand. Heavy, almost black, sometimes passed down through the family. Grandmas would swear you could taste the history in food cooked in a pan like that, and honestly, they weren't wrong. Cast iron gave food something no other pan could. Cornbread baked in one turned golden and crisp at the edges, while stews took on an earthy depth after hours of gentle bubbling. And don't forget the slow cooker, called the crock pot by most families, which was a marvel of its day. You'd toss in chunks of beef or chicken, root vegetables, spices, and maybe some condensed soup for a little extra flavor. Then you'd put on the lid and let it simmer all day, filling the house with warm, savory smells that wrapped around you like a blanket. Every meal, big or small, revolved around the table. It wasn't just a place to eat. It was where stories got told, homework questions were asked, and the time between supper and bedtime felt endless. One-pot dinners were perfect for this rhythm. They came together quickly, fed everyone, and left fewer dishes for someone, let's be honest, usually the kids to wash up afterward. But behind the scenes, there was serious planning and skill going into everything. Families had to stretch their food budgets, so cooks leaned hard on recipes that used leftovers and made pantry items last. Think about a chicken dinner turning into a chicken and rice skillet the next night, or ham hock flavoring beans that showed up in sandwiches or fried up with eggs in the morning. Nothing spoiled, nothing wasted, because every scrap of food had a purpose. Some tricks bordered on genius. Stale bread? Cube it up. Toss in some milk and eggs. Bake it with cinnamon and sugar. Bread pudding. Wilting vegetables? Chop them into soups or stews, where nobody would notice they'd been rescued from the end of their shelf life. Even bacon grease got saved in a tin by the stove, because it'd add smoky flavor to cornbread, grits, or fried potatoes. Cooking together also meant sharing knowledge. Recipes weren't always written down. They got passed along by watching, tasting, and doing. A kid might learn to measure by sight, to add just enough salt by tasting, or to extend a stew with a scoop of rice. Sometimes, recipes only existed in memory, and you measured ingredients by handfuls, pinches, or just till it looks right. And one-pot cooking let you improvise. If you were out of carrots, you could chop in turnips. If you didn't have pork, maybe smoked turkey, or even just a few leftover bones would do. The dishes weren't fussy, they were meant to feed a crowd, to come together with whatever the family could find, and to guarantee nobody left the table hungry. There's a kind of beauty in that practicality. Sometimes you'd find Grandma standing over the stove, a wooden spoon in hand, humming while her stew spluttered away. She'd call out, "It's almost ready," and folks would drift in. Sometimes the whole meal would be nothing but a pan of beans, some hot cornbread, and a couple wedges of a homegrown tomato. But the laughter, the warmth, and the stories, those made everything taste better. Of course, things weren't always perfect. There were times when the fridge looked bare, and it seemed impossible to conjure up a real meal. But that's when the creativity really shined. Maybe you'd make hobo stew with whatever was left, or stretch a can of salmon into salmon patties with onions and saltines. Every dinner told a story about where a family came from, what they'd weathered, and how they stuck together. Those kitchens were filled with more than just food. They were filled with ingenuity, resourcefulness, and a sense of community that came from cooking and eating together. The 1970s kitchen was never fancy, but it was rich in love, laughter, and problem-solving. Cooks measured success not by how gourmet a meal looked, but by how full everyone's bellies were and how much fun was had before the plates were cleared. One-pot wonders were the star of all this. They let cooks feed a lot of people, quickly and on a tight budget, without sacrificing flavor or tradition. Maybe it was a bubbling pot of hobo chili or a skillet supper with just a handful of sausage, peppers, and some egg noodles. Some families even counted on a Friday mystery pot, where everyone tossed in whatever was left from the week. And somehow, it always tasted amazing. So, was this way of cooking just about saving money and time? Not quite. It was about bringing folks together and making every meal matter, even the ones thrown together at the last minute. It was about finding joy in doing more with less, and turning the ordinary into something worth remembering. But there's something else you might be wondering. What were those quirky, deeply loved one-pot dinners that families kept making, week after week, sometimes with the same ingredients, sometimes with a new twist? And how did some of these get such colorful names that nobody ever forgot? Get ready, because the next part is a full-on parade of the most unforgettable and often forgotten hillbilly one-pot dinners you've probably never heard of. And trust me, some of these dishes and the stories behind them are about to surprise you. If you could peek inside kitchens from small towns and back roads across the hills and hollers back in the 1970s, you'd hear the same thing: the gurgle of a bubbling pot, spoon scraping, and people calling out names that sound more like tall tales than recipes. These dishes had a story. Always. Sometimes, the name said it all. Other times, you needed to taste it yourself to get the joke. So, let's dive into 25 of the most colorful, rare, and resourceful one-pot wonders that made dinner a little adventure. First up, hobo stew. There's a reason every region has a version. You'd round up whatever meats and veggies were left, toss them in a big pot with some tomato sauce or broth, and let it all simmer until the flavors bound together. Some joked the secret ingredient was whatever's about to go bad. It could be as simple as potatoes, carrots, onion, and a single sausage link stretching to feed 6. A glug of ketchup, maybe a splash of Worcestershire, and let it ride. Then there's leather britches. Sounds wild, but it's really beans, usually green beans, dried by hanging them on a string above the stove. In winter, those wrinkled beans would go into a pot with pork and cook for hours, soaking up bacon's smoky flavor. Each bite told the story of summertime, preserved for the cold months. And if you sat real close to the pot, you'd smell a memory of green gardens and sunshine. How about raccoon and sweet taters? This one's exactly what it sounds like. At least in some parts, folks would catch a raccoon, clean it, then bake it up with sweet potatoes, onions, and whatever wild herbs they had. It was a feast for special occasions when wild game meant survival. Most families just told stories about it. But in the right season, you'd smell sweet potatoes caramelizing in the drippings. Next comes burgoo, a wild stew from Kentucky packed with squirrel, rabbit, or whatever meat was on hand, thickened with cornmeal and filled out with beans, cabbage, and okra. Legend says the recipe called for at least 3 kinds of meat, but even chicken or beef bones would do. The pot never rested, just kept simmering, each day getting deeper and richer in flavor. Now, have you ever tried squirrel pot pie? This wasn't the flaky pie you're picturing, but a big doughy casserole, squirrel meat, carrots, and thick homemade dumplings, cooked slow until the broth turned golden. Some families swapped in chicken, but the tradition came from using what the woods provided. Let's not forget poor man's supper, a skillet dish with nothing but potatoes, onions, and a few strips of bacon for flavor. Sometimes an egg cracked in at the last minute turned it into breakfast the next morning. There's something special about the crispy bits at the bottom, scraped up with bread, and smothered in whatever sauce the bacon left behind. Beans and greens was another staple. Collard or turnip greens cooked until silky, bacon or ham hock flavoring every bite, and always served with a hefty scoop of beans. It was sustenance disguised as comfort food, and when you opened the pot, the steam carried a punch of smoky, peppery aroma. Moving along, we get to slumgullion. The name alone makes kids laugh, but moms loved it for cleaning out the fridge. Pasta, ground beef, tomatoes, corn, beans, nothing matched on paper, but somehow, in the pot, magic happened. Melted cheese on top if you had it, and enough leftovers for lunch. Try telling a friend about son-of-a-gun stew, and watch them squint. Cowboys made this on cattle drives with whatever meat and offal they could spare. Families adapted it, using beef shank, potatoes, carrots, even a splash of coffee to deepen the broth. It smells hearty and looks humble, but one spoon reveals layer after layer of flavor. Here's Mulligan's stew, born from the railroads, brought into the home. Meat, potatoes, odds and ends, it was a meal shared with friends. Recipes changing by the day. Sometimes neighbors would show up and add their own bit to the pot, turning a simple supper into a patchwork of kindness. Corn dodgers and butter beans, cornbread fried up as little dumplings, dropped right into a pot with creamy lima beans and ham. The dumplings soak up every drop, turning pillowy and golden in places. The taste is smoky, sweet, and deeply southern. Campfire hash is just as it sounds, chopped potatoes and onions fried with leftover meats, maybe some bell pepper, in a skillet. It'd crisp and sizzle, making the house smell like a camp, wood smoke, meat and memories mixing together. Some folks ate it with hot sauce, others crowned it with a fried egg. Mountain baked rice, a dish of white rice, onions, and stock, all layered with chicken or rabbit and mushrooms, then baked right in the pot until everything's tender and savory. The rice on the edges would brown up and get crispy, a treat to fight over. Rabbit and dumplings was a special occasion affair. Catch a rabbit, then simmer it until tender, thicken the broth, and drop in fluffy, oversized dumplings. The whole dish would perfume the kitchen with sage and pepper, and the dumplings would soak up every drop. Fisherman's catch chowder, whatever swam in the river that week, catfish, perch, even crawdads. Tossed in a pot with corn, potatoes, onions, and maybe tomatoes. The broth would turn milky, rich, and briny, and a sprinkle of fresh parsley finished it off. Stuffed pepper skillet simplified the more formal version. Peppers chopped up and tossed in a pan with hamburger, onion, rice, and tomato. Fewer stuffed peppers, more time for flavor. The whole house would tingle with the aroma of peppers as the pan sizzled. Hillbilly cabbage roll casserole. Instead of rolling cabbage leaves around a meat mix, you just layered everything. Ground pork or beef, rice, cabbage, tomatoes, in one big pot. One ladleful delivered every flavor at once, and each bite was juicy, tangy, and perfectly tender. Haymaker's hash, meant for hungry workers at the end of a day, it included sausage, potatoes, onions, and sometimes apples for a sweet crunch. The apple's caramel edge cut the fat and brightened each serving, making it surprisingly complex. Sweet corn and tomato goulash combined sweet corn kernels, diced tomatoes, macaroni, and a splash of hot sauce. A little cheese on top, and you had a budget-friendly, comforting casserole. Liver and onion stew, strong, rich, and not for the faint of heart. This dish made use of what could be sourced cheap. Slow simmered onions mellowed out the sharpness of the liver. Served with potatoes, or sometimes spooned over rice to stretch it farther. Okra and tomato pot. Sliced okra cooked down with tomatoes, bacon, onions, and garlic. Sometimes a few shrimp or sausage slices got tossed in. It was sticky, tangy, and deeply filling, with every bite popping with summer garden flavor. Turkey neck and potato soup brought tough, bony turkey necks together with carrots, onions, and potatoes. The necks turned silky and rich when simmered. The potato thickened things, and the whole pot would get salt and peppered until just right. Chow chow hot pot. Take the tangy pickled relish called chow chow and mix it with beans, ham, and whatever root veggies were on hand. The pickles brought bite and color, and every spoonful was a taste of summer gardens bottled up for winter. Cathead biscuit and gravy bake. Soft, oversized cathead biscuits nestled in a skillet, smothered with sausage gravy and baked until bubbling. The biscuits puffed up, soaking in the gravy, turning creamy inside, crispy outside. Last but not least, apple stack cake stew. Not really a stew at all, but the name stuck. Chopped apples cooked with brown sugar, cinnamon, and biscuit dough rounds, each layer stealing syrupy sweetness from the last. The smell was enough to make the whole neighborhood drift in for a bite. Every one of these dishes tells a story about tough times, wild harvests, big hearts, and a belief that good food could turn any night into a moment to remember. Some sound strange. Some might tug at your nostalgia. And, behind it all, there's an unspoken rule. When you cook with what you have and share what you make, nobody ever eats alone. So what was the magic element in all these dinners that's missing from modern cooking? How did people turn scraps and odds into recipes that still live on in memory, even as the cookbooks gather dust? Get ready, because next, we'll take a closer look at the methods and everyday ingredients that turned kitchens into places of true creativity. Let's get down to the heart of how those legendary one-pot meals really happened. It wasn't all magic or luck. It was about knowing your tools and making the simplest ingredients sing. Step into a smoky kitchen for a second. You hear the click of the lid coming off a Dutch oven, the gentle pop and fizz from the coals, and maybe the smell of onions just starting to show golden in the bottom of the pot. That's where everything began. First and foremost, the cast iron pot was king. These were more than just pans. They were family heirlooms, often seasoned by decades of suppers. A true hillbilly cook knew exactly how to heat it, when to check for the sizzle, and how to spin it a quarter turn so nothing stuck. You'd see these pots resting over open flames outside, or nestled down in an oven, radiating warmth. They kept things steady and even, making them perfect for slow bubbling stews or the crispiest cornbread edges you'd ever taste. Many meals started the same way, with a flavorful base. You'd toss diced onions into that hot skillet, the hiss rising as they released their scent. Garlic came next, maybe some chopped celery, or a heap of peppers if the garden was full. Then salt pork, ham hock, or a bit of cured bacon started to melt out its fat, turning everything smoky and savory. The kitchen filled with the promise of something special, even if the ingredients were plain. Layering flavors wasn't just about taste, it was about stretching what little you had into something you'd remember. Say you started with a chicken carcass. You'd roast it to draw out its flavor. Then simmer it slowly with carrots, onions, and black peppercorns, building a broth that could carry noodles or dumplings. Chunks of potato thickened everything, turning broth into a hearty stew in no time. Frugality was the guiding principle. Leftover meats weren't ever wasted. They were reborn in a soup or hash. If you had pork one night, the bones and trimmings flavored beans the next. Bits of sausage perked up cabbage stews, and even wilted greens were revived by a quick blanch and a toss in bacon grease. Root vegetables were everywhere, because they kept well and filled you up. Carrots, potatoes, turnips, and rutabagas rounded out every pot. These veggies soaked up flavors like a sponge, going from tough and plain to buttery, sweet and fork tender, with just a little patience. When money was tight, adding a handful of rice, barley, or noodles would fill out a meal and keep hunger at bay. A lot of flavors also came from wild greens, things foraged right from the backyard or a patch of woods. Dandelion leaves, pokeweed, ramps, lamb's quarters, all these greens could be washed, chopped, and tossed into soup or beans. Sometimes they were a touch bitter or spicy, but that only made the meal more interesting. These, mixed with a handful of picked herbs like wild thyme or mint, turned basic dishes into celebrations of the season. There's something to be said for slow cooking too. Letting a pot simmer for hours gave flavors time to meld, making even the toughest cuts of meat fall apart in your mouth. The house would smell so good, people started sneaking into the kitchen, pretending to help just to steal a spoonful. The steam fogged up the windows, and the air felt heavy and delicious. Seasoning was a balancing act. Most cooks back then learned to taste and tinker as they went. Salt was a big deal, not just to flavor, but because it kept foods from spoiling. Pepper, black or red, brought just enough heat. Vinegar was a secret weapon. A splash at the end cut through the fat or brightened a pot of greens, picking up those tangy southern flavors. Even a well-timed squeeze of lemon, if someone had it, worked wonders. Now, let's talk about stretching a meal. If a recipe called for a pound of sausage, but you only had half, you might bulk it out with beans or leftover bread. Dumplings, fluffy or chewy, would stretch stews, soaking up broth and making every bowl feel huge. Potatoes, rice, noodles, and even torn-up stale biscuits made the difference between a pot that fed 4 versus one that could fill up 8. Nothing went to waste. Bacon grease was saved by the stove in a tin. Corn cobs flavored simmering beans. Even empty pickle jars found new life storing dried beans, soup mixes, or home-fermented kraut. The kitchen was a hub for repurposing, improvising, and getting creative with less. Let's not forget the power of the slow cooker, then a newish gadget called a crock pot. It changed the way people planned ahead. You'd toss in stew meat, potatoes, carrots, onions, maybe a can of cream of mushroom soup if you splurged, and walk away for hours. Guests would come over, open the door, and be greeted by a cloud of meaty steam. Dinner was suddenly possible around a busy day, instead of something hurried through fast. Hands played a big role. Knives were sharp but simple. Veggies were hand-chopped, sometimes uneven, sometimes expertly precise depending on the cook in charge. You'd see someone's hands stained by beet juice or marked with pepper seeds, and know those hands had shaped the entire meal. Cooking like this isn't just about nostalgia. It's about respect for the food and the time it takes to make something good. Those essential ingredients, dried beans, root veggies, garden greens, pork fat, could be made 100 different ways and never taste quite the same twice. Every dinner became a mix of old habits and new surprises. Taste testing was part of the fun. Grandkids would lean over the stove, stealing nibbles with the promise not to tell. Cooks would beam with pride when a friend from down the road stopped by, drawn in by the aroma. "You got something good in that pot?" became a regular greeting. Maybe there would be hot pepper vinegar left on the table to spike your greens. Or just a dab of homemade apple butter for your cornbread, sweet and tart at the same time. To top it off, all seasoning relied on gut and experience, not a big rack of spices. Salted pork, pepper, cider vinegar, maybe a hint of molasses, these staples made every dinner lively and bold. The meals weren't just filling, they were lively and full of character because of it. So, how did the careful practice of slow cooking, layering flavors, and making the most of every scrap keep families fed and traditions alive? Why did these skillful ways of stretching meals and turning nothing into something important vanish so quickly? That's the next, and maybe the hardest, question. We're about to see why these food traditions started slipping away, even as the recipes hid in old boxes and faded memories. Walk into a kitchen in the late 1970s or early 1980s, and you'd see a lot was changing fast. The clang of cast iron on the stove was being replaced by the dull beep of a microwave. Shelves started filling up with frozen dinners and boxed mac and cheese. Suddenly, the old one-pot wonders, the recipes that felt like family heirlooms, began to disappear one by one. Why did this happen? The answer has as many layers as a good pot of soup. It started with time. Families were busier than ever. Moms, who'd often stayed home and cooked everything from scratch, began working outside the home more. Dads faced longer commutes, or even changed jobs to keep up with the economy. Kids juggled after-school activities, and TV schedules started carving up dinner hour. Suddenly, spending an afternoon simmering beans or layering a slow-cooked casserole just wasn't practical for most people. Along came convenience foods, frozen TV dinners, boxed potatoes, instant gravy mixes, soup packets, and anything you could just add water to and pop in the oven or microwave. Supermarkets stacked aisles with colorful boxes and bright packages, promising quick meals and less work. No grease splatters, no hours by the stove, sometimes even no dishes. Commercials flashed across new color TVs, showing smiling families eating the latest heat and eat meal. Everyone got drawn in. Who wouldn't want more time and less hassle? But advertising didn't just sell convenience. It started steering taste buds. Suddenly, creamy, cheesy, or sweet flavors replaced the smoky, tangy, and peppery ones from cast iron pots. You saw new products every week: snack crackers, instant pudding, cheese in a can. The idea was sold that cooking from scratch was old-fashioned, and eating fast, processed food was a sign you'd made it. Kids grew up with quick mac and cheese and toaster pizzas, and the old flavors started tasting weird or too strong. Economics played its part too. The 1970s and 80s had plenty of tough years: recessions, gas shortages, and rising prices. With money tighter, a lot of families felt like it was smarter to buy cheap, filling foods in bulk. Processed foods looked like a bargain. Sometimes they really were. You could feed a household with a giant box of cereal and a gallon of milk instead of a stew that needed hours, beans, and smoked meat. For some, it meant less food waste and more predictability. But there's something else. Recipes started to vanish because the way they were passed down changed. In the old days, you'd learn a recipe by standing next to your mom, grandma, or neighbor, watching, tasting, and learning the feel of the meal. Measurements weren't written down. You learned them by heart and hand. When families got busier, those precious teaching moments slipped away. Recipe cards got lost, phone calls didn't last as long, and when the old folks passed on, so did many of their favorite dishes. And let's not forget the culture shift. As times changed, the country's eyes shifted toward modern tastes and trends from big cities and TV cooking shows. Fancy French sauces, Italian pastas, and fast food burgers suddenly became what everyone wanted. Kids went off to college, came home, and didn't want to eat soup beans or wild greens. They craved pizza, burgers, and flashy desserts they'd seen at the diner. Old school food started feeling, well, old school. Archival footage shows families gathered around tiny kitchen tables, everyone digging into a single steaming pot, smiles and hands passing cornbread or green beans. Then you see the contrast. Sleek 1980s kitchens, microwaves humming, kids eating on the couch, everyone grabbing a meal at different times. Meals got lonelier, and some of the warmth, literal and emotional, that came from a bubbling pot in the center of the table fizzled out. For a while it seemed like processed foods were a lifesaver. But over time, something else faded too. The stories behind the food, the history, the lessons, the family jokes got lost. If Grandma's leather britches stew wasn't made for a few years, nobody remembered how to do it. The root flavor of rural kitchens slipped away, replaced by whatever was quickest, easiest, or came recommended on a shiny box. Did all those dinners taste better? Sometimes, sure. There's a thrill in newness. But deep down, people started missing the old flavors. You'd hear someone at a family reunion ask, "Whatever happened to the goulash Aunt Maria made?" Still, some folks bucked the trend and held on. Maybe they cooked their beans in secret on Sundays, or thawed out a leftover ham bone and threw together a pot of hobo stew when company came over. But for the most part, as culture sped up and family dinner shrank to a quick pit stop, those one-pot wonders slid away into memory. That brings us to now. The shelves are lined with ready meals. People grab takeout more than ever. But there's a pull in our hearts, a nostalgia, maybe even a little guilt, about the flavors and traditions that faded from our tables. But what if you could bring these foods back? Not just the recipes, but the feelings of comfort, connection, and discovery that came with them. In the next part, we'll take you step by step through how to revive, and maybe even reinvent, these hillbilly one-pot wonders in your own kitchen. The question is, what would it mean to bring them back? And would they taste as good as we remember? So here you are, standing in your kitchen, maybe with a faded recipe card, or just a memory of a dish you tasted once at a grandparent's table. The world has changed, sure. Supermarkets are filled with ingredients folks in the 1970s never imagined. Bags of greens cleaned and ready to go. Choices from every corner of the globe. Gadgets the old cooks never dreamed of. But the hunger for something real, warm, and true to our roots is still there. So what if you could bring those old one-pot dinners back and make them fit your life today? First, don't stress about getting everything exactly as it was. Those 1970s cooks were never rigid. They used what they had, tweaked things, and swapped ingredients as needed. If you can't find smoked ham hock, try thick-cut bacon or a little smoked paprika. Want to keep it meatless? A can of white beans and some mushroom broth can give just as much heartiness. The trick is to get the base flavors right: onion, garlic, smoky or meaty notes, and a handful of fresh or dried herbs. That's what gives a simple pot of beans or a skillet of hash its hidden magic. Old kitchen tricks are still handy, even with new conveniences. A slow cooker is great for setting stew in the morning and coming home to dinner, just like the crock pot was for families in the 70s, except now the timer will buzz you when it's ready. Dutch ovens and cast iron skillets are easy to find, and they still bake up the best cornbread or let you brown a pot roast like it used to be done. Don't be afraid to use a food processor to chop veggies if you're in a hurry. Even an instant pot can turn tough beans and meats tender in a fraction of the time. You can also simplify old steps and keep things fun. Frozen pre-chopped onions, canned tomatoes, bagged greens, these are all time savers that don't take away from the finished dish. There's no shame in leaning on store-bought broths, as long as you give your meal a chance to simmer with touches of vinegar, pepper, or even a pinch of sugar to balance things out. That's the spirit of those hillbilly cooks. Use what you've got and make it work. When it comes to updating flavors, make it yours. Modern extras like hot sauce, a bit of harissa, or even a dash of soy sauce can wake up an old dish. Try swapping brown rice for white, mixing new greens into your beans, or adding some grated cheese on top. The point isn't to get a museum-perfect copy. It's to fill your kitchen with the kind of smells and sounds that make people wander in and ask, "When's dinner?" Invite folks into your process. Just like the old ways, make it a family or community event. Have kids peel carrots, let friends choose a new spice, or cook a big pot to share with neighbors. Start a new tradition, maybe a retro dinner night once a month, or a contest to see who can bring back the wildest old-school recipe. Share your creations on social media or local pages. Post a photo, tell the family story behind your dish, and invite others to join in. Most of all, realize how important the feelings around the meal can be. The old recipes weren't just about taste. They were about spending time together, telling stories, fighting over the last dumpling, and laughing about burnt bottoms or big spills. They were about hope. No matter how little you started with, there was always enough by the time you set the table. The same thing is true now, maybe more so. Don't be shy about tweaking the old with the new. Turn leftover veggies from the fridge into a fresh take on hobo stew. Mash up bread ends for a quick bread pudding. Throw garden greens into your beans, or drop dumplings into any simmering soup. Every change you make is a way of honoring that creative spirit. Want to get started? Pull out a simple recipe, like beans and greens, skillet hash, or a slow-cooked chicken and rice. Invite someone to cook with you, and while you're chopping and stirring, talk about the meals you remember and the people who made them. Pass on what you're learning. The more stories you share, the more these recipes live again. Finally, remember that reviving these old flavors isn't about being stuck in the past. It's about rooting yourself in tradition, bringing people together, and making something real in a world that sometimes feels too fast and too fake. Cooking like this slows things down, opens up time for conversations, and fills your home with the kind of warmth you just can't microwave. So as you plan your next meal, maybe flip through those old recipes, or make up a new one in honor of a forgotten dish. You'll taste not just the food, but the memory, the hope, and the promise that anybody, anywhere, can turn a pot of humble ingredients into a feast. Maybe, in the end, that's what makes these dinners worth saving. What forgotten flavors are you ready to bring back?